Hello and welcome to Story Untold. I'm Martin Bauman, and this one is a special one. Charlie Engle is a world-class ultramarathon runner. He's run across the Sahara Desert, became a documentary narrated by Matt Damon. He's done Ironman competitions. He's run through jungles, volcanoes, mountains. He's a motivational speaker and author. He's spent time in federal prison. And he's a recovering addict, 25 years clean and sober. He is one of the best examples that if you can laugh at yourself, you can find a way to come out on top. And his story is like none you have ever heard, I guarantee it. This interview, I could have easily kept going for another hour, but you got to stop sometime, and who knows, maybe there can be a part 2 someday. Here it is, my conversation with Running Man author Charlie Engle. You know, Charlie, I hardly even know where to start with you because you have done so many different things, so many different accomplishments and life moments. But I think I want to go back to the beginning with you and to probably one of the earliest accomplishments that I read about, and that is running a 5-minute mile when you were in grade 8.
Man, what I wouldn't give to be that fast again. That was so easy, in hindsight, and anybody that's ever run though understands so I was like 12 years old, and I can remember distinctly that year. It's the first year I'd ever really run track, and I was 6 feet tall, so I was basically the same height I am now, but I was about 50 pounds lighter. You could barely see me if I stood sideways, but I could run, and it was fun, and I enjoyed the freedom of it. And I had run from the time I was a kid, but I'd never run anything structured before. So racing was completely foreign to me. So in that first year, all I did was just run as hard as I possibly could from the very start of every single race. And partway through the season, I figured out that there is a little strategy, and sprinting off the start line is not always the best way to go. So, but it was a good time. I mean, I broke 5 minutes, and I did it actually a lot. And unfortunately, then I figured out in high school that girls like football players. And so I started to put on some muscle, and my times didn't slow down. I got faster, but relatively speaking, everybody else caught up to me and eventually passed me. So I should have stuck to running.
Okay, I want to know, so for a guy who has run across the Sahara Desert and for someone who has an addictive personality as you, what were you like as a kid? Were you driving your parents up the wall, or what was your personality like?
Man, that's a good question. I don't think anybody's ever asked me that one, which is awesome. What was I like? I mean, I think I was an only child, first of all, so it meant that I had to do a lot of self-entertaining. And I grew up in this very bohemian situation. So my mother, who was very young, 19 when I was born, I like to say that I was lovingly neglected when I was a kid. So, I mean, she was awesome. She was my hero. And yet I pretty much raised myself in the sense that I set my own bedtime, and I sort of got up when I wanted. I liked school for the most part, so I was willing to get up and go to school. But, as a kid, I was pretty just kind of free. And the free range kid idea comes to mind. I just sort of did my own thing. So I didn't drive them crazy. I would have driven them crazy if they were paying attention. But they really weren't watching all that closely. And for the most part, I just kind of skated through. I figured out early on that making good grades got me better attention than making bad grades. And so I sorted that out. And once I found sports in 7th grade, man, I was just busy. I mean, my addictions didn't kick in until college, when I actually once again had freedom. I was that high school kid that played, 6 sports and produced a TV show in the morning at my school, and was the, president of this club and that club and class president. And I didn't have time to breathe, much less, smoke weed or get drunk. So I was actually a pretty straight kid back then. Wasn't until I got to college that I screwed all that up.
What was the TV show that you were producing at the time?
So every morning in my high school, it was a fairly like experimental high school, especially for the late 70s in North Carolina. And so they had a closed circuit TV system throughout the community, throughout the whole community. So every morning I was up at 5 and I would run. And by 6, I would be at the radio station picking up the AP wire. Of course, there's no smartphones, no computers. And so I'm going there to get the day's news from the previous day. And I would get to school. I'd spend half an hour actually writing about an 8-minute show. And instead of like the morning announcements over the PA system, I got the chance to actually write, produce, and perform a morning television show on the air in high school. And it was fantastic. I've never seen a tape of it, and I don't know if one exists. So in my mind, I was awesome. I imagine in real life it probably wasn't that great, but I like everybody else too. At that age, man. So then I go to college, 1980, and shortly thereafter, ESPN pops up. So of course, and CNN and all this, and I decide, of course, that I want to be an on-air, anchor person for one of those kind of places. But again, my college career was less than stellar, and those dreams kind of went by the wayside. But I really loved it. I loved the idea of performing.
What else? You mentioned being a multi-sport athlete, 6 sports or many sports. You mentioned the football already, and of course running too. What else were you doing at the time?
So I got to do some things that probably most people wouldn't advise, but also you wouldn't be allowed to do now. So I was a good enough runner that the cross country coach let me train on my own. And so I ran cross country and ran the cross country meets, which were on different days than the football game. So and the football coach would allow me to miss. It was like Tuesday afternoons was always cross country. And so I would miss practice on that day for football, but the rest of my running I would do myself. I played basketball, and I actually wrestled only 1 year. So that was absolutely awful. It was number one, I was a terrible wrestler, and being as tall and stringy as I was, but it taught me a lesson. I didn't want to do that. And then, of course, in the spring at U.S. schools is baseball and track and field. And I actually only played 1 year of baseball too. And I wasn't a particularly good player, but in high school, we actually had this amazing team, and I went out for the team. I'd never played baseball before in my life, and I went out for the team because I thought we might win a state championship, and I just wanted to be part of it. And sure enough, we actually did. We had a couple of guys go straight to the pros, and I was just an add-on player on that team at best. Yeah, but that was it. I loved trying everything. Growing up with my mother, she wasn't a sports person. She loved to watch sports, but I didn't do anything, as far as participation. And then in 7th grade, I moved in with my dad, and everything changed. And he was a big sports fan. So, of course, to try to please Dad, I played everything.
Your parents, were they same city, different cities when you were growing up?
Man, my dad was in California. My mom was in North Carolina. So by the time I was like at 7, I flew by myself across the country, which again is just crazy to think of now. But most flights then like that, North Carolina, Raleigh, Durham to San Francisco were nonstop. Now it's all broken up with all these regional jets, and it's hard to find nonstop flights. But back then, that was kind of what you did. And so my mom would put me on the plane, and my dad would pick me up in San Francisco. And we actually, several years in a row in the summer, I'd fly out, and my dad would drive me back. So my wanderlust began like really early. I remember driving across the Mojave Desert in California and Arizona, and no air conditioning. We're in a little Triumph Spitfire, and my old man's driving. He's 6'5", and he's driving the car with his knees and drinking a beer. And it was, It was 1970 at that point, and things were just so different. But it imprinted on me, and I never stopped wanting, and still haven't stopped wanting to see the world.
What do you think you got from each of your parents? The traits that you got from your mom, or the things that you picked up from your dad, and you could see that now, the resemblances.
Well, and this is a little bit unfair to do this to you, but so my mother just passed away last week.
Mm.
So I have spent a tremendous amount of time thinking about my mom lately, and actually, struggling to write an obituary because she was such an amazing woman. But she was a writer and an activist, gay rights activist, civil rights activist. I mean, she was a person for the downtrodden who really never thought about money. I mean, she should have thought about it a little more probably, but it was like if she made a list of what was important in any decision she made, money rarely made the top 10 as long as she had at least just enough of it. So I think I did get my social conscience from my mother, and my desire to change the world and to encourage people to look at the world they live in. It's very complicated now, as we all know, with social media and everything else. But my father, on the other hand, was more of a pragmatist. He started at 19 wanting to be like a civil rights attorney, and I don't know what happened. They got divorced, and he took off and went to the army and went to Germany, and he basically just disappeared from my life, and for about 5 years. And by the time he came back, he was more money focused. And so I did learn that one does need to actually make a living, especially if you want to go do fun things. And so, I think my dad gave me a little more of a straightforward viewpoint of the world, and one that, things have to be done. And my mom was all dreamer all the time, and really just a loving, incredible person.
I'm sorry for your loss, first of all.
Yeah, thank
So your mom's in North Carolina, your dad's in California. How do you settle on UNC? You want to go to college there?
Yeah, so my dad actually, they both went to Carolina. So they both attended college there, and I had a long history there. And I was accepted, I'm happy to say, at a lot of other schools. And it was interesting, though. I wanted to go to North Carolina, and actually I wanted to play football. And I had an invitation to walk on. I wasn't good enough to be offered a scholarship, but I had an invitation to walk on. And it was the school that was an hour down the road. And I was not the guy. I applied to schools in California and all over. But when push came to shove, I decided on the safe choice, which is still, while I'm a Tar Heel through and through, and I love my school, and it would not change that. I wish that I also could have experienced something different, either going to school in another country or certainly in another state. I even had a crazy opportunity in the 70s that I turned down. Well, I guess technically 1980, when I graduated from high school. I was offered a scholarship from North Carolina A&T to actually go play football there. And it's a traditionally African-American university here in North Carolina. And at the time, talking a little politics, at the time, HEW, which is Health, Education, and Welfare here in the U.S., had a lot of mandated quotas for black students to get into white universities. But the converse was true, too. Black universities actually needed a certain number of white students at that time to also meet their quotas. So it was an interesting time. And part of me always regrets not taking that opportunity, because I know culturally and from a worldview, it would have been a much riskier and in some ways far more interesting path to take. But I didn't choose that one. I went to UNC, and I don't regret that for a second.
When was your time at UNC relative to Michael Jordan's time at
And
UNC?
Michael Jordan and I were like practically roommates. We were so tight. No, I'm just kidding. But I was there though I was there with Michael, and I was actually part of. So I broke my ankle playing basketball the first week of my freshman year, and I never played any football, but I went out for the JV basketball team, and I made the team. And our current coach, Roy Williams, was actually the JV coach back then. So I made the team, and this is 1981. I made the team, but I knew I was never going to play varsity basketball, not at Carolina. And so I was offered an opportunity to become a manager, and I became a team manager because that was one path to potentially being on the varsity. But I did get this incredible opportunity to be around and on the court and actually play ball with Michael, with James Worthy, with Sam Perkins, with, certainly some of the greatest Tar Heels and a couple of the greatest players of all time. So they were,
get out of here.
And they were
That's
just
incredible.
They were just kids, man. They were superstars, but they were kids, both, especially James Worthy and Michael Jordan were both just from small town North Carolina and two of the greatest, top 50 players of all time. Obviously, Michael, arguably by many accounts, the greatest player ever. But it was a trip, and he was never any different than he is today. The most competitive human being I've ever known. He would not let you walk away from the ping pong table, the poker table, the bowling alley. Anything he did, he wanted to win. So, and that, I think that served him well in his career.
So you're at UNC, and I think like many of us, from being a standout in high school and your time before, you go to a bigger place and you realize the things that you excelled in before, suddenly you're finding it harder to stand out, being the quarterback of the team or things like that instance. How did you respond to that, or how did that affect you?
Yeah, well, so in my book, I write about the fact that I thought for sure there'd be a banner, a Welcome Charlie banner when I got to college, because I was just that awesome in high school, right? I mean, that was, and I didn't really feel that way, but that's always my joke. I mean, I accomplished a lot in high school, but I get to Carolina, there's 4,000 other shiny new freshmen there who have the same or better credentials than I do. And I found out really quickly that I was average at best. And it struck me hard, it really did. I mean, I did poorly in school right off the bat because I didn't know how to study. I'd been smart enough in high school to just kind of skate by and still be a, top 10 in my class student. You get to college and damn if they don't expect you to actually study and to turn in assignments on time and do things like that. I didn't understand. But I figured out very quickly in North Carolina in 1980, the drinking age was still 18. And I figured out very fast that I was an absolute brilliant all-American drinker. And I could drink with the best of them. And that became, unfortunately for me, my hobby to begin with, and then my vocation later, and then it became the thing that sort of sustained me. And I spent my years at Carolina in a alcohol and drug induced fog. The 80s were the cocaine decade. I don't know what this decade's probably the heroin decade we're in now, but back then cocaine was just ubiquitous certainly on a college campus and really in society in general. And, I had lots of friends in college that could do a little bit and party and have some fun and actually go to bed and get up and go to class the next day. I was not that guy. And, for me, once it started, it didn't end until, I didn't have any more money, or I was in trouble, or, passed out in some unfamiliar corner somewhere.
How did it start for you? What was the introduction to it for you?
In college, drinking was just, the introduction was just being in college. As for cocaine, I did join a fraternity, and it certainly wasn't their fault, but that sort of an atmosphere made it super easy to be introduced to things. And it was as simple as, we were on a road trip to another university up in Boone, North Carolina, in the mountains. And, the guy I was sitting next to just, he pulls out this little vial of white powder and basically, It was called a bullet, and he shows me, he asks if I want some, and I don't even know what it is. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
what is it? And he tells me, and then, he does a hit, and then he kind of shows me how, and I do it. And frankly, I didn't get anything out of it that time. It was like, I don't see what the big deal is. The next time I did it, though, everything changed. And I did a couple of lines, and it was like some, super light switched on in my head, and it didn't really switch off again for 10 years.
Was it like the 4th of July going off inside your head at the time, or what was the sensation?
It was. I mean, in my book, I actually describe it as a Klieg light going on. So it's this super brilliant, bright light, and all of a sudden, I had plans. I was gonna make my father proud and make perfect grades and cure cancer and solve the world's problems. And that's what cocaine did. It lit me on fire, and it cleared my mind. And, it seemed like there was nothing I couldn't do. And then, of course, 20 minutes later, you need more of it. And then it starts all over again. But with addiction, my experience was that I spent the next 10 years basically chasing that first experience and trying to match that initial feeling, which I've said quite often, I think most of us do in some way, shape, or form in many aspects of our lives. We have these interesting and cool first experiences, and we try to replicate that, and it's just not that simple.
Yeah. Did your fraternity brothers clue in at some point that you were not the same as they were as far as being able to use and then, put to a side and remain productive or go about their, the course of your regular life?
They noticed. Eventually, everybody noticed, and I would just disappear for chunks of time. And I wasn't alone. We had 100 guys in the fraternity, and so there were a handful of us that were pretty much the same. And so we found each other and reinforced that behavior. And and there was some fun had for a while until it wasn't. And and then college ended, and I went out into the quote unquote real world, and that behavior just continued for me. I didn't know how to leave it behind. Everybody else took their entry level jobs, or they went to grad school, or they did whatever they were doing. And you ask about fraternity brothers. One of them, and I thank him for it still to this day. He called my father after one particularly ugly binge of mine, and really told him, you need to come get him, because he's not going to make it. Like, he's not going to survive this. Mm-hmm. And that's what happened. My dad came and scooped me up and took me out to Seattle, where they were living, and I just sort of disappeared for a very long time.
And what year of university would that have been for you?
So for me, that would have been technically I nearly finished my junior year. So it was, pretty much the beginning of my last year. But that first semester of my last year, I basically stopped going to class and, stopped doing anything.
At this point, were you seeing it as a problem ever, or were you still convinced that that you couldn't see what other people saw?
I don't think so. I mean, I knew how low and awful I felt at the end of a binge and getting up the next day, and because I would stay up even at that point, I'd stay up 3 or 4 days at a time. And so, I would have had to have been crazy not to notice that, that I did have a problem. But I don't know, things are just so different. It's funny, I try to think back now. In the early 80s, there wasn't any like campus club or system there was nowhere for me to go. Like today on a college campus, everybody enters college knowing you might still screw it up and you might be an addict and it might be a hard way to go, but you actually know, you're very aware that there's answers. I have 2 boys that were, in college in recent years, and you couldn't ignore all the signs that say, get help if you need it. Back then, there wasn't any of that. The only kind of the only thing said was, don't screw it up, and if you, if you don't go to class, there wasn't anybody to help, I guess. And if there was, I didn't know about it. And so for me, I carried that on out into my work life. And, to balance my addiction, I basically spent years overachieving in business. I would find a way to be the top salesman at the fitness club, or, I sold cars for a while and was the top Toyota salesman in the United States one year. And I found ways to compensate for the other things I was doing, because my attitude was, I can't possibly be an addict if I'm the best salesman, if I can buy a house, if I can buy a car. Yeah, maybe I party too much, but as long as I'm taking care of business on this side, then what's the big deal?
Right. So fast forwarding a little bit for when you were selling cars, but before that, you move out west again with your dad, and you start running a Baskin Robbins out west.
Indeed.
How did that go for you?
Yeah, well, as I like to call it, I went to Sunday school and learned how to make ice cream cakes, and it was an experience to my dad was thinking of trying to be an ice cream magnate, and we would buy a bunch of franchises and basically let me run one of them, and I tried very hard to run it right into the ground. And I wasn't capable of doing it. I started dipping into the till, but I would always put the money back. Like I would go buy drugs, and I'd buy enough to have some to do, and I'd sell the rest, and I'd put the money back before morning, and until eventually, that didn't happen. And and it was messed up. I mean, it was a terrible, awful way to be. And I felt badly, the vast majority of the time. And that, in that period of time is when I was like, all right, this really is a problem.
When did it go from cocaine in powder form to then crack cocaine?
Interestingly, it wasn't a conscious decision, because I was traveling, and I'd started this new business. So out of the car business, I started a business in what was called at the time, and still is, paintless dent repair. And a lot of people know what it is, but it's fixing cars without painting, fixing the dents in cars. So I formed a company, and I started chasing hailstorms around not just the country, but the world. And what it allowed me was a tremendous amount of freedom and almost no accountability. And so I would get to a new city, Atlanta, Denver, Chicago, wherever I might go, and Orlando. And one of the first things I would do, I'd figure out where the bad neighborhood was, where that neighborhood that I knew I could drive down and probably score something. And that's what I did. And one time in Denver, I pull up to somebody that's clearly dealing, and I'm looking for powder cocaine, and they say no problem, and they get in my car, and before I know it, they come back, and it wasn't powder, it was crack. And I like absolutely refused to do it. I was like, no, I there's no way I'm going to do that. I always swore that I wouldn't. And I remember that moment, very clearly. I mean, as I was saying, there's no way I'll ever do this. I don't want that. I already knew I was going to. That addict in the back of my mind was already taking control and saying, just this one time, because, addicts are suckers for their inner addict. That's the voice that gets listened to. And it's a very hard voice to resist. And so on that particular occasion, I took my first hits of crack, and it's pretty much all I thought about for the next couple of years.
So you mentioned at the time you're doing paintless dent repair, and the money is good from it, and the danger that comes with that, with there's money to spend for somebody with an addiction, this is a very dangerous combination. How many times did you try to quit before it stuck for you?
Well, sadly, I had a very not funny joke. I was like, Man, I can quit anytime. Quitting's easy. I've done it 100 times.
Right.
Which is, which obviously is moronic if you think about it. And so to answer your question clearly, though, I tried to quit. I really tried to quit probably 20 times before it finally stuck. One of those times was in a full-blown 28-day treatment center, and I made it through that program, and I learned a lot. I learned a tremendous amount. I also knew deep down that my inner addict was saying, this isn't the end. This is just a break, and you got to get this under control, and everything will be okay later. And I basically treated that time like a graduation almost. So I treated that 28 days like I would taking on a 100-miler today. I'm like, I wanted to be the best addict in treatment. I wanted to ace the tests. I wanted to say the right things. I wanted to mend the right fences. I wanted to do all these things because I wanted my family to be happy, and I wanted to be able to get a job. And I just wasn't ready, though, to really take command of this idea that I wanted to live a sober life. So after that 6 months of sobriety, that was when I really went just crazy and was lucky to survive really the next year and a half.
What was that bottom for you, that rock bottom?
When I did finally quit?
Yeah.
It's pretty simple, actually. My first son, Brett, was born in May of 1992, and I was really fighting hard to stay sober at that point. But I knew that I didn't want. I grew up in a household where, with my dad, where alcohol was a very present part of our lives, and not in a good way. And I knew I didn't want my kids to grow up in that kind of atmosphere. So I basically just took it for granted. I said, you know what? That's it. I'm done. No way that I'm going to do any more drugs after the birth of my son. And so sure enough, he's born, and, I'm sticking to this commitment, white knuckling it, though. I'm not actually doing any treatment. I'm not doing anything. I'm just not using drugs. And, my son's mom, my wife at the time, and my son came to visit me a couple of months after he was born. I was working on the road in Wichita, Kansas, and they came to visit, and it was one of the best weeks of my life. I had this little tiny baby, this 2-month-old tiny little thing, and it was the most love I'd ever felt in my life. And I had feelings I had no idea that I was capable of. And after that week, I took them to the airport and dropped them off, and inexplicably drove straight to the hood and spent the next 6 days smoking crack and drinking and killing myself. And it was at the end of that binge, watching the police go through my car and bullet holes in my car, and understanding that those bullet holes were put there by somebody trying to shoot me. And it sounds crazy to say it this way, but it really was like one of those moments like, this seems like a pretty good time to quit. And of course it wasn't that simple, but here's the thing. Nobody else could save me. I thought my son could actually be my savior. I thought he could stop me from being a drug addict. And the final dose of reality of understanding that there was no one but me that could actually make that happen is why it all changed.
Was that a scary moment, thinking that you might not be around to see your son grow up, and
Absolutely.
seeing those bullet holes in your car?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I look, as an addict, and any addict, I don't want to speak for other addicts. I shouldn't say that. But my experience is most other addicts have experienced times when, they were willing to die for their addiction. Like they reached a point where they just simply didn't give a shit. And dying was just a reality. Not that they wanted to die, although
Hmm.
I will say it's a fine line. There were times and certainly moments, instances where I was at such a low place that, if you asked me in that moment if I wanted to die, I probably would have said yes. But, I think it just is that moment for me made me realize that my death was imminent. It was not some abstract thing floating around out there that might or might not happen. This was real, and either the drugs or another person were going to end my life. And if I didn't want that to be the case, then I better get my act together.
Do you think we miss out? And I say we, I guess collectively as as a culture and a society. Do you think we miss out on humanizing people with addictions and in forgetting that these are people who experience guilt and shame and all the range of emotions that everybody else does?
Well, I'll answer your question maybe a little too provocatively, but you can't, we put our addicts in jail and in prison in this
Hmm.
country. We have almost no sympathy for addicts in general. Our families do for us, and certainly our circle of friends, but there is such a societal limit that is reached so quickly. So you're way more likely as a teenage or early 20s drug addict to end up in jail or prison than you are in a treatment center. And every single statistic known to man, other countries do it so much better. We can look at their stats. There is such empirical proof that, every dollar spent on someone for treatment early on in their
Hmm.
addiction will save society $10 later on, because they're going to end up incarcerated. They're going to end up, with a lifetime of misery. And so, to answer your question, if that wasn't clear, I absolutely think that, society needs to stop with this tough on crime attitude towards addicts. Look,
Right.
if you cross the line, if you pull out a gun and go rob a liquor store, look, you're going to jail. But if you're the average everyday run of the mill drug addict, which is what the vast majority of addicts are, help. Even if it's not compassion that makes you help, fiscal responsibility should make society way more interested in helping that person. Even if they don't care about him as a human being, just fiscal responsibility should make them say, okay, look, we got to give this guy or this girl a couple of chances before we throw them in jail. Because I got to tell you, nobody gets better in jail.
Hmm. Hmm. How grateful or lucky did you feel to have reached a point where you were finally ready to embrace sobriety, and it hadn't come at the expense of being landed behind bars or ending up in a state where it did cost you your life?
Man, that's a great question because I was so naive at the time still. The world was so different. You actually had to answer a telephone that was plugged into the wall in your house at that point still. I just had my 25-year clean and sober anniversary. And so it's hard to imagine, because I think we all sort of superimpose all of that on what society is like today. And so
Right.
just there's not all that. I didn't actually know. Like, in college, I dealt drugs, but I sold it to friends. I wasn't out on the street corner or anything. So in my mind, I wasn't breaking the law. It didn't like occur to me that I was actually doing something that was, particularly illegal. I mean, certainly I wasn't stupid. I knew if I got caught with drugs, I could be in trouble. But I just didn't appreciate the danger that I was probably in, both
Hmm.
from a legal perspective, but certainly from a physical perspective. In my 20s, man, I mean, I was Superman. And I think most 20 somethings think that that's the case. Like, this is just something I'm doing now. I got plenty of time,
Hmm.
and I'll get my act together and I won't do this anymore. And months stretch into years and years to decades for a whole lot of people. And or if they're lucky, they get decades. A lot of them, of course, now with skyrocketing overdose rates in this country and a real lack of a plan. We're missing any kind of leadership in this country in any arena towards dealing with this problem. And it's a big ship. It's a luxury cruise, or a luxury cruise ship that takes, in this case, it'll take turnaround. There's no single policy that's all of a sudden going to change all of that. This is going to go for so long. So anyway, my politics are showing.
How did you feel in those first weeks, those first months of sobriety?
I was absolutely, as we say in sobriety, I was a pink cloud guy for sure. I wanted to, because I didn't know any better. I wanted to go pull all my drunk friends out of the bars and show them this awesome new life that I had. And of course, they all told me to piss off. And I finally, I had a great first sponsor. I was very, very lucky to have an old timer who'd been around for many, many years, and he taught me the best lesson still that I've ever learned in sobriety. And that lesson is, it's written into our traditions, but it basically is this idea of attraction rather than promotion. If you want to give other people the opportunity to have the same joy and freedom that you do, then you just need to live. You just need to do your thing. You need to be. And if other people see you and they see your joy and happiness and they see the kind of life you're living and they find it interesting and better than theirs, because if they're an addict, they will see it and recognize it as a better existence, then they'll come to you. And they'll say, how do I get some of that? And when that happens, then all the rules are off. But the second I start a sentence with the words, unprompted or unasked, if I start a sentence with, here's what you should do, I know I've blown it. Because nobody wants to hear that. So in those first years, what I finally figured, it took me a little while, but what I figured out is I just needed to mind my own business, gain back the trust of the people around me, family and friends, because nobody trusted me, rightfully so. And time would heal those wounds and close those gaps. And if I just did that, then everything would be okay.
Had you maintained that connection with your family and close friends throughout those years, or was it a reconnecting process for you with some people?
I was an aloof person in general, and so yes, I maintained a lot of friendships and close relationships with family, but pretty much on my terms. And very close with my mother always, and my mom always knew what was going on, and she was the most worried about me. And I told her the truth. At least I told her as much truth as I understood about myself, because I really didn't know very much. I didn't know why I was doing what I was doing most of the time. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand why I couldn't go to a freaking bar and have 2 beers. I just didn't understand it, even though 100 straight times I would go in there for 2 beers and leave after having 20. And still the dream lived on. Like somehow I was magically going to figure it out. And my mom was the only one who really, I think, understood that. My father was a lot harder and more judgmental, and I steered clear of him for the most part, unless I was doing well, and then I wanted his approval if I could get it. But generally speaking, I kept touch with a lot of people. I mean, I'm a social person, and I like my old friends, and it has been nice through the years for many of them to see both my struggles and my triumphs, and to hear them remind me of what I was like back then, because I still need that reminder every once in a while, that in case that little voice keeps finding its way back into my brain telling me that I can still have a couple of beers.
Hmm. Was it a 12-step program for you, or what was it that did the trick?
Yeah, so when I was in Wichita and I finally made the decision to get sober after that 6 day binge with somebody shooting at me, really I got up the next morning. I did two things. That night, that same night, I went to an AA meeting. There was no more treatment center or whatever. There was nobody to pay for it and whatever. And I knew the answer. I always say that, the treatment center absolutely screwed up my using because the first time I went to treatment, I would say, I don't know what to do. How do I get out of this? Oh my God, my life is so bad. How am I going to get past this? Well, then I go to treatment and then I actually know the answer.
Hmm.
Oh, you mean if I just do these things and I take these steps and I follow people who've been successful before me, then I might be successful. And so after that binge in Wichita, I knew what to do. And so I went to a meeting that night and I got up the next morning and I put on my running shoes and I went for a run, and I threw up half a dozen times in the bushes and in the shower and in front of little children getting out of their minivan and saying, gross, what's wrong with that man? And that's what I did every day for the next 3 years. I went to a meeting every day and I went to, I put my running shoes on every day. And I trusted my sponsor. And when he told me that if I just kept doing that every day, that I would have a chance to build an actual life and one that, filled with feelings and potentially with, love and affection and, children that actually liked me and all of that. And those were, part of his promises to me. And in the program of AA, of course, we have something called the promises. And that's part of that, that if you stick around long enough and you do the things that other people do, some people have a problem with 12-step recovery, and I understand it. And I think my opinion is those people are misguided in the fact that they think there are actual rules. It's everything about the program is a suggestion. It's up to me to make it work or to, I'm not a religious person. So AA uses the word God, quite often. But to me, it's not
Hmm.
God. It's not a Baptist or Catholic or, Islamic God. It's just, kind of this spiritual being out there that I get to talk to when I go run. And and people make the mistake and I think it's because they're resistant to being told what to do. Addicts don't like to be told what to do.
Hmm.
And I finally found my way into understanding that it was up to me to figure out how to do this program.
You've said before that drugs and alcohol had been your way out, and that running was going to be your way through. Tell me about what running has done for you.
Wow, man, it's done everything for me. And it's given me freedom. In those first few years, I got the question occasionally from people who I would say didn't have my best interest at heart, but who would say, didn't you just switch addictions? And that's runners get that all the time.
Hmm.
Sober runners these days, I still hear it, and it's just nonsense because for me, and what people don't understand, addiction was all about hiding. It was about being invisible and feeling nothing.
Hmm.
Running is all about feeling everything. You can't hide when you're running an ultra marathon. Who you are is completely turned inside out and revealed for anybody that's around you to see. So there is no hiding. So am I addicted to running? Absolutely. But it's not I don't forget where I parked my car, or if I do, it's not because I was, shit faced the night before.
Hmm.
I don't spend all the money in my bank account. I don't stand up my friends and family and not show up for 6 days because I've gone out for a run. Well, wait a minute. Have I done that? Maybe I've done that one, but no, I'm just kidding. But they know where I am at least. And that's the difference. And it frees me. It frees my mind. For me personally, AA was not enough. I needed the combination of a really strong physical outlet And what I learned was, after running through more than 40 countries at this point, what I learned was seeing the world from the soles of my feet is so much more satisfying and meaningful than seeing it from, the passenger seat in a tour bus. And that's what running has done for me. It's given me a relatable way to see the world, because I like going to Africa and South America and places, communities where maybe they don't have what we have here. And when you run into a small town or village, instead of driving into it in a Range Rover, you're treated differently. And you actually get this opportunity to be part of the community if you want to be. So that's what running has done for me. It's allowed me, to see the world outside of myself, but through pushing myself physically, getting a chance to know myself better.
I know what you mean by that feeling of being welcomed into a place. Having traveled by bicycle, I know very much the feeling of being treated as if you're a guest of somebody rather than if you're driving through town, and people looking out for you, making sure you're safe and being taken care of. It's a really special feeling.
Yeah, well, the world relates to running, especially the third world. They relate to running and to cycling because, generally speaking, that's the only ways they have to get around. The vast majority of this planet doesn't actually own a car. We all lose sight of that, because our biggest problem is, whether our car breaks down or if there's traffic.
Right, or the price of gas on every day.
The price of gas. And the rest of the world, the rest of the world's on foot anyway, or riding bikes. And so when you go into those places and you do it, Americans have a bad rap, of course, for going to places and trying to Americanize it. They want to go there and find America. And I do consider myself an ambassador of sorts. And I try to go to foreign countries and take in as much of their culture as possible and be as much like them as I possibly can to assimilate for at least a short period of time. Because otherwise, why in the hell would I go there? If I want America in a foreign country, why would I ever leave here? It doesn't make sense.
You have one of the most improbable, I think, stories of getting involved in ultramarathons, starting in Brisbane. I would love to hear it told from you.
Yeah, wow. It's not one of my brighter moments, but I was that dude. I'd run already dozens and dozens of marathons by that point. I was a few years sober, and I thought I would be, and I would be happy being, that old guy at 90 years old running his 280th marathon, probably bent over crooked at the side and taking 8 hours to finish the race. Like, that was fine with me. I was happy with that. But life had other plans. I went to Australia, and I was there for work, chasing a hailstorm, actually a big hailstorm there. And first thing I did when I went to another country is I would join I'd find a running club, and I would find an AA meeting. And that's what I did there in Brisbane. And I finished a run one day with a group at a running club, and we went into the store afterwards, and there was a little notice on the wall for a 5K for the upcoming weekend. And I ripped off the little banner with the directions on it. Because again, don't forget, we don't have Google at this point. So there's no GPS or Google Maps. You have to actually have printed, written directions. And so I tear these off, and that Saturday morning I get up in the middle of the night and I start driving out to where this race was. And when I get there, and I have an adventure getting there, but I'll give you the slightly truncated story. But I have the adventure getting there. I run over a kangaroo with my car, and he's still okay, I tell myself. And I get to the start line, I go up and get my number, and I'm pinning it on, and I'm listening to these guys close to me talk about how hot it's going to be that day and how they hope they can finish before dark. I'm like, Jesus, this is a 5K. What are they going to do? Crawl? And I start laughing, and one of them asked me, he's like, so, mate, have you ever done a 50K before? And I'm like, no, why? And and I walk back up to the table, and I'm like, hey, do you have a map of the course? And sure enough, it's like, it says 52K actually. It's 52K and it's written everywhere. 52K, 52K. It's on my race number. It's on a banner. It's on the race directions. It's on everything. It never occurred to me that anybody would ever run farther than a marathon. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why anybody would do that. But, ultimately I'd driven hours and run over Bambi of Australia. And I decided that I would do part of this race because it was a loop course. I was going to do one loop instead of three. And I do that loop and I end up finishing that loop in the top 10. But I'm quitting. Like, I'm done.
Mm-hmm.
And the cute girl from behind the checkout counter comes up and says, "You're continuing, aren't you?" And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, of course." Because we say stupid things like that, guys do. And I do continue on. And I finished the second loop, and I realized that I have an opportunity here. Something changed. I finished that second loop, and I was like in fifth place. And I just decided in that moment, sunburned and chafed and blistered, that I was going to finish this thing. And so I'd go out for the last loop and I come up to the finish line and, I'd run farther than I'd ever run before in my life. And I had shown up that day intending to run a 5K and I'd run 52K and I ended up actually winning the race. And it was just this surreal experience and it changed everything. It changed everything because after that, all I cared about was figuring out exactly how far I could go.
Yeah, screw the 5Ks. Let's run across the Sahara Desert.
Yeah.
What compels somebody to do that? I mean, you did that starting in 2006, spending 4 months running across the Sahara. Where'd you get that in your head?
It was really the culmination, though, of many years. I really did. I started doing races of hundreds of miles and running across jungles and deserts. And I just, with a friend of mine who ended up running across the Sahara with me, we came up with this idea of sort of wondering. Ray Zahab, Canadian guy, actually, and he's the one who blurted out the bad idea to begin with. And I'm the one that pursued it. And the why was as simple as no one had ever done it before, and there are very few firsts in the endurance world, that are left anymore. And it gave us this incredible opportunity to see if we could do something that had never been done. And in the meantime, Matt Damon produced a film, and we ended up raising more than $6 million for clean water and co-founded H2O Africa, which today has morphed into water.org. And anybody that follows Matt Damon can see that he's still, really involved. And so in that case, we did something because we wanted to do it, but it ultimately led to a greater good for each of us individually, but for the world as a whole.
Take me into those 4 months, if you can, of a particular moment in time as you're running across the vastness and the bleakness of this desert and what you're feeling. Is there a moment of, geez, what did I get myself into at any time?
Oh, yeah. About 1,000 of those, but I would say that, so like after the first week was hell. We basically dove down into the abyss and it seemed like we would never get out of it. And we were injured and sick, and Ray and Kevin in particular, my co-runners, were really having a lot of problems. We had logistical problems. We got lost. We ran out of food and water. Everything that could go wrong went wrong in that first week. And I actually what I did was I took the lessons of AA. I took the lessons of sobriety and said that, okay, I need to approach this differently, and I need to stop worrying about getting to Egypt because I'm not even going to make it to the next country. Mm-hmm. And on that next day, I got up and all I thought about was running a marathon in the morning. And I got to lunch and took a break and had a bite to eat and got up in the afternoon and ran another marathon. And that's all I thought about. And went to bed that night on my little thin foam mat and stared up at a million stars in the sky because there wasn't an electric light, for 1,000 miles. And I went to sleep, and then I got up the next day and I did it again. And by focusing on the little things, And each day and each even little section, we slowly made our way across the desert, and we found our rhythm. And it, despite all the times when it seemed like there was no way we would succeed, including being, until 3 days before we got there, we were not granted permission to go to Libya. And so we were running all this way, thousands of kilometers, not knowing if we were even going to be allowed to continue. And that was very hard. That was the hardest part, was mentally worrying about whether or not this run was going to end, not because of something that we did, but rather, just simply by politics, basically not being allowed to continue. But Libya actually agreed to let us in, I think, because they didn't know what else to do with us. I don't think they thought we would actually keep going. And we were essentially showing up at the border as uninvited guests. And I mean, look, I always said, though, if they turned us away, if I got to that border and they turned us away, I could live with that. I would have gone as far as I could possibly go and not another step. But I wasn't going to quit before then, just based on the knowledge that we might not be able to get in. I think people do that too often. They assume the outcome and pull the plug on things, life, relationships, jobs, runs, sobriety. And, you don't know the outcome. It's got to keep moving forward.
As you're crossing this desert, how far, how many hours or how long is a period of time between seeing people that are outside of your immediate crew?
Oh, man, we would go days at a time without seeing anyone. And when we would see people, very often it would just be, nomadic Tuaregs, the native people of the Sahara. We would go through stretches where we would hit a lot of villages if we were on, roads, what passed for roads. That was rare, but generally speaking, I was taking a bearing on a compass and we were going straight. So, we were heading east, and if east took us through a village, then that was fine. If it didn't, then we had a wonderful tour guide, Muhammad Iksa, and he would disappear sometimes for a day and magically show up with food and water and everything we needed. And I had no idea where he would go, but he would just pull it out of the desert. But we would go a lot of days without seeing anyone. And those were actually, I enjoyed going through the villages and interacting with people. But man, it was awesome to be out there with nothing and no one and no phone and no, nothing that is considered a modern convenience. And it was as it should be.
I think we'd agree to disagree on that one. It's not a common person, not every person that finds it awesome to be so isolated like that. What are you doing when you have to go to the bathroom? You just dropping right there as you're running, and then continue on, or what are your options?
After the run was over, one of the first talks I gave was to a friend's first grade class, and that was the only question that they asked me after I talked, was where did you go to the bathroom? I'm like, it was the world's biggest sandbox, Right. So dig a hole, go, cover it up, move on, And it was actually very simple. It was all very freeing, There's nothing like. I think I would say that anybody that travels, there's this panic we all have over not being in contact and not having our cell phone and whatever. But if you go to a place where there is no coverage and it's simply not an option, it takes a day or two. But if you can just let those couple of days pass without having a panic attack, it's fascinating what happens when you disconnect and when you just allow yourself to be somewhere and be fully present in that place.
You go through the depths of addiction. You get your life back on track. You run across the Sahara, and then when you think you've reached all these heights, you end up in prison. What was that period like for you?
Yeah, those were good times. No, I'm just kidding. It was terrible. It was awful. It was unfair. It was unjust. But I actually am able to keep it in perspective now, and I now realize. I mean, I was the most fully prepared person maybe ever to go to prison. And what I mean by that is I was 19 years clean and sober. I had run a hell of a lot of hard miles, including, across the Sahara Desert. And I understood the importance of one day at a time, like for real. Mm-hmm. So when I went to prison, and just or unjust, fair or unfair, whatever anyone thinks, I had to approach it in this way, and of making the best out of it and taking it one day at a time and being open to a new experience. One I certainly never would have chosen for myself, but I went in there and I followed the rule I talked about a little while ago: attraction rather than promotion.
Hmm.
I wasn't going to walk up to, the biggest guy there and say, "Hey man, you look like you could drop a few pounds. Why don't you come run with me?"
Hmm.
That would not have been advisable. But, I started to run. I taught addiction recovery classes. I had a little workout group, and, I made the most of the experience, and it was actually fantastic in many, many ways.
Did anybody leave an impression on you after that time was over?
Oh yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, again, I don't know if this steers clear of politics or not. I was going to say I'm going to try to steer clear. I'm actually not going to. I was in there with tons of guys, in particular black guys, who, were treated unbelievably badly by the justice system, and who were given incredibly long sentences for, 20 or 25 years for tiny amounts of crack cocaine.
Hmm.
And, it was certainly hard for me not to look at them and think that easily could have been me. But in general, I was the white guy driving around the neighborhoods, and back in my using days, and not one time I never got stopped, not once. And it's just not the way it works. I was lucky, I guess, but I'm not sure of all the meanings behind that. So what I learned more than anything was a lot of people left impressions on me, because the vast majority of what was in there were just very average people, and a whole lot of drug addicts who, got caught buying weed from the wrong person, and, end up with some conspiracy charge and 15 years of prison. And it was, most of what I learned is it was nonsense, and it was criminal college. I learned more about crime. I mean, if I ever actually wanted to learn how to actually commit a crime, prison's the place to go. Because there's no rehabilitation, there's nothing good about it. And I always say, it's what I don't understand about it. Society still doesn't get it. Like, everybody's going to, 98% of the people that are in prison, or maybe it's 96, something like that, are going to get out someday. So who would you rather have next to you living as a neighbor? The guy who got his college degree while he was in prison and learned a vocation or a skill, took classes, was given opportunities, or the guy that was basically got the beat down every single day by staff and by, just the system in general, and he gets out angry and without a single skill, and ultimately just ends up on the public dole for the rest of his life. Society gets to pay for him forever, because he can't do anything, can't get a job, can't vote, can't do anything. It's so backwards. So if I was there for any reason, some other greater reason, it was because I needed to see the absurdity. Are there people that belong in prison? Absolutely. There's a lot of dangerous people, and that's what prison was made for. That's what jail was made for. Jim Webb, who was a senator from Virginia, famously said, and I love this saying, prison is for people we're afraid of, not people that we're mad at. And, and everybody where I was just people that society was mad at and decided to just throw them away. So,
Right.
It needs to change. It's costing us a fortune in both, human means and certainly in dollars.
And we talked earlier about humanizing people who deal with addictions. I imagine that certainly was a humanizing process for you in seeing what the inside of a prison looked like and the people who populate it.
Yeah, well, in federal prison, there's no addiction treatment, zero.
Mm-hmm.
You get nothing. You get addiction. You get drug education. So if you get a 20-year sentence, in year 18, you're eligible to get drug education, which isn't anything like treatment. It's basically, you suck, you're a drain on society, don't do that anymore, is essentially what you learn. And
Right. And that's called rehabilitation.
right, exactly. And if you take that class, you can get 6 months off your sentence. And it's just, again, it's just, prison itself is punishment. Being in prison is punishment. What happens to you in prison is not supposed to be punishment. It's not the way it was ever designed. It doesn't work for society. And again, I'm not talking about the dangerous. I'm not talking about murderers or rapists or armed robbers even. You pull a gun on somebody or physically threaten them in some way, look, that's not okay, whether you're high or not. And there are some people that society needs to be protected from. But we need to find a different way. I mean, clearly, we're at record numbers of people in prison. And look at the addiction problem in this country. Is it solved? Not only is it not solved, it's skyrocketing right now. So exactly what have we accomplished by we're just going to build a bunch more prisons and keep putting people there? It's just, it's idiotic, and it just doesn't make any sense. And, maybe someday somebody with some power or society will figure out that this isn't the way to handle it.
You've mentioned in other writing and in speaking that humor has been a big thing for you. If you could think about how you've had that ability to laugh in the grimmest of circumstances, to be able to endure and survive and even enjoy almost anything. Can you tell me about that?
Man, humor has been my other savior other than running. And actually, humor works for me in running too, because despite what people might see from the outside, I don't take it seriously. And that doesn't mean that I don't train hard. It doesn't mean I don't want to do my best, because of course I do when I do a race or when I'm taking on an expedition. But man, this is all just fun and games. I'm not the greatest runner in the world. If I got a choice to be the greatest runner in the world or the funniest guy, I would much rather be the funniest guy. And when, in fact, when I got married, I told my wife she gets to be the beautiful one and the artistic one, the smart one, all of those things, but I get to be the funny one. Like, she doesn't get that. And she reluctantly agreed, because she may actually be funnier than me. But I think what it is I deflect. I've used humor as a tool, especially as an addict, to deflect serious situations. So that's not always a good thing, but it was a coping mechanism of sorts. But I love wordplay. I love to laugh. I love to make fun of, myself in particular. I try with those people closest to me to remind them that if I'm picking on them, it's because I love them, and hopefully they're okay with that. And I don't know, it just doesn't matter what happens to us in life. It just doesn't matter. All that matters is what we do about it and how we approach it. Anything can be good or bad. And I don't mean that to be cliche. I've experienced it for myself, and anything can be good or bad. My addiction, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Give me a pill right now and I could be, I could drink like a normal person. Why in the hell would I want to do that? First of all, I never saw any real benefit in that. But secondly, I would never want to lose the addict part of me, because it's all the best parts of me. If I'm not drinking and using, it's the thing that's made me successful in some things. It's the thing that's made me, good at some things. And it's given me drive and determination and quirkiness and humor. And, you can only throw up on your shoes so many freaking times and not laugh about it. I mean, I learned early on that if you're not laughing at yourself, then, somewhere you've decided that life just isn't any fun. And, I always want it to be, it doesn't always have to be fun, but I want it to be, I want to appreciate it as I'm living it and not just look back at it and tell stories. I don't even like telling, my wife gives me a hard time because I don't like telling stories about stuff that I've done. I'm way more interested in in talking about what's coming up next. I mean, whatever it might be, even if it's, tomorrow's run, whatever, because I like to look forward. I understand the importance of looking back, and I don't dislike talking about it, but I want to go forward.
If I could ask you lastly, what is forward for you?
Yeah, I'm always looking for some new adventure, and there's one I've been talking about for a long time that, hopefully will come to fruition in the next couple of years. And it's, I've gone from a lot of low points in my life to a lot of highs. So, I've talked for years about going from the lowest place on the planet to the highest point. And, even doing that on every continent. And I've even talked about doing it in every state in the United States. And there's some symmetry, and obviously the analogy is pretty easy to find, that, we all go through deep lows in our lives, and we strive to reach those highs again. And for me, it's kind of, it's my daily goal. It's my weekly, monthly, and yearly goal. It's what I want to do, is to keep, I don't want to stop trying things. And sometimes I try them and they fail. And so I might be in that low point again, but that just gives me the opportunity to try again.
Charlie, thank you so much for sharing your story. I appreciate it.
It was great. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, Martin. So thanks for having me.
That's it for the show. Thanks for listening, and I hope you liked it. If you want to know more about Charlie, head to his website, charlieengle.com, and check out his book, Running Man. The paperback version just came out. If you enjoyed the show, you can do me a favor and subscribe. It's on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, and Player.fm. You can also help me out by spreading the love. Pass it on to someone else. Let somebody else hear about the show. Theme music for the show is by Dr. Turtle off the album You I'll Ah. Once again, I'm Martin Bauman, and this was A Story Untold. See you next time.